Welcome to the Christchurch Fox Chapel podcast. It's the fastest growing conservative, evangelical, charismatic,
delicate
podcast in the entire Fox Chapel area. And today, Reverend Ben and I should be talking about a delicate matter.
A highly delicate.
Highly delicate
No,
matter.
not delicate, but delicate.
Oh, delicate.
Yeah. We're everybody's favorite thing to talk about.
Divorce!
Talking about divorce.
Yes.
So we're in the Sermon on the Mount, and we've been kind of going through, and I don't think either of us can really figure out or remember why we're preaching about lust and divorce in the same week. There's some logic to it, but we made the road a while ago, but we thought like we'd split it up, as you all know. And so we have two podcasts this week. So we just talked about lust, and now we're talking about Jesus' teaching on divorce.
Yeah, and this is the part of the Sermon on the Mount where Christ has set out some basic principles in the Beatitudes that we're all in sin of various kinds, every single one of us. And so if we sort of get boastful about thinking somehow we're amazing spiritually, we need to go back to what we've been calling box number 1, which is our summary of the first 3 Beatitudes. We sin, we're grieved by our sins, and we know that we're not righteous people. And if we're feeling really condemned by something, particularly a difficult subject like divorce, which probably, and I'm guessing, affects about a third of our congregation.
Yeah.
In terms of whose parents have been divorced, maybe you've been divorced, or your kids are getting divorced, you're contemplating one.
I don't know anybody whose life is not in some way touched by a divorce.
Yeah, that third may be a very conservative estimate, but it's a really distressing thing. And some people who've been through it would say it's like a bereavement, but worse, because at least when someone dies, you get sympathy cards and care.
Yeah.
Whereas people aren't quite sure what to do with the divorcee sometimes. It can be really difficult. You end up suffering the suffering.
Yeah.
And so if that's you, then it's time to go back to box number 2. Brackets, it is a circle.
I just have to note, you've really outdone yourself this time, Alex.
Okay.
Because first you gave me the passage on conjugal rights.
Conjugal rights, yes.
Which I, by the way, at the 5 p.m. service, preached to a congregation who was majority children. That was fun to edit on the fly into a PG version. And
I mean, there aren't many PG sermons out there on conjugal rights, are there?
I don't know if it's really possible. Because at that age, I still thought that like we came from like cranes that dropped us off.
Oh, meaning presumably the bird and not the construction.
Yeah. I mean, either could be possible equally.
I would think. I would love to know. I would love to hear a list of the euphemisms you employed during that sermon. I'm sure there were many.
It was like one of those things where I thought like, okay, I'll edit. You just edit out.
Did you just wink? How did you convey to the adults in the room what you really meant?
Well, there was no way. There was just no. It was so. There's so much. It was such a thoroughly PG-13 topic.
English law used to call it consortium. It was a good phrase.
Yeah, there was no way. So I was like in vain looking through my manuscript before I'm about to go preach. I'm like, what do I cross out? Like, there's no sermon left.
Brethren, tonight I should be speaking on the matter of consortium.
Conjugal rights. So you gave me that. You gave me various other texts on sexuality. So of course I get the divorce sermon. Thanks.
No worries.
And
no
lust.
problem at all.
Yeah, it should be great.
For those of you that are thinking, well, you know what, all of this talk is just too difficult and I'm just going to do what I want, and you're looking at culture or you're looking at your own desires and seeking to reverse engineer some theology to suit your feelings, this is a box number 3 moment for you. You have in fact been called by the God of grace to live a transformed life. And so this, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is doing this wonderful thing. You were warning me yesterday not to sound so gracious that I give people license to go and do the wrong thing.
Oh, yeah.
Sermon on the Mount's great because if your problem is that you're actually feeling proud of how good you are, you need to be reminded you're a sinner. If you're feeling like you can just go and make up your own ethics on the fly, you need to be reminded you've you've actually been called to holy living. Jesus does both.
Paul treats this in Romans, right? Like he's like, some people will say, "Let us sin so that grace may abound."
Great one.
And he doesn't even address it. He's just like, their condemnation is deserved. Because when you've truly received the grace of Christ, you can only do that from a low place. And when you're in the low place, then you recognize, you're like willing to just follow his way.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think this is going to be a subject that can, if preached badly, either call people into ungodliness or just leave people feeling really ashamed.
No pressure, Ben.
No pressure, you'll be fine. But neither of those things is a gospel sermon.
No.
The art of a gospel sermon is to speak about holy living in the context of what God does to us by grace.
There's no truth without love.
Yeah.
And there's no love without truth.
Yeah.
And God is God of both of those.
Now, it might also be worth just zooming out and looking at the wider context of the letter, right? So, or of the sermon, rather. So, Jesus has said, "You've heard it said, ... but I say to you." Mm-hmm. Everyone gets angry. Everyone has a problem with lust. Everyone has this tendency, thinking of the week ahead, to make promises and break them.
Little white lies, or like, yeah, I'll take care of that.
Dishonesty and boasts and kind of, and vows. I'm going to do this thing. People have this tendency to retaliate when they've been hurt, and all these things. Well, divorce, in the same way. I mean, I said in the announcements last week, in a sense, we're all divorced, and people sort of nodded. What on earth did I mean?
Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Oh, I thought you could tell me. Well, what I mean is that all of us have broken relationships. Yeah. Of all kinds. And maybe even if we're not married, we have, in a sense, meddled with other marriages.
And our sinful tendencies and proclivities have broken, have caused us to be unfaithful to the commitments and covenants that we make with other people, especially those who are closest to me. Did you ever notice this at home that noticed after a few years being married to Jenna that the normal courtesies that I usually pay to strangers slowly can start to erode in the household if you're not careful.
Kat said this to me. We'd been working here for about 2 or 3 years, and we went away for a anniversary night to a hotel, and I was, this is going to be great. It's romantic. It's a really beautiful hotel. It's just going to be fantastic. And we got to the room, and she just said, "I'm really unhappy." And you are married to the church and not to me. Essentially accusing me of having an affair with my job. And I know this was a real surprise to me, which was part of the problem. It wasn't like I just go, "You're right." I was like, "What on earth are you talking about?" And she said, I don't want to be married to this kind of a husband. For her, leaving me felt like a way out. Now, we have, that was quite some time ago, 8 or 9 years ago. We have, I think, honestly, one of the best marriages that I know of, and so there's real hope there for anyone that's in that low point.
But you guys have been through it.
But we've been through it, and part of the problem was I didn't know we were going through it until she told me we were going through it. But that was part of the complaint. So I think many of us listening to this have either been through a divorce or we've been through periods of our marriage that are broken, and maybe we've had to have reconciliation or whatever, because marriage is hard.
It's really, really hard.
But the gospel applies to this subject like any others, and Jesus is not shying away from delicate matters.
Yeah, and I think there's I was in a church once where we had a policy of never counting the number of people who came. And the reason was that we're under grace, we're not under law, so we don't need to pay attention to numbers. Okay. Numbers aren't what matters. But I realized in retrospect what was actually happening is that everyone was kind of being an ostrich, burying their head in the sand, because if we addressed sort of what God's intent and standard and all that is, we couldn't handle the condemnation.
Right.
But actually what the sermon, and I'm often like that with my sins. Like, I don't want to think about my failures. I don't want to address it because I think then I'm condemned. But what Jesus does is he like brings it right up. He brings on the uncomfortable conversation.
Yeah.
Where we're forced to see our sin, and then that's the place where we can actually receive mercy and grace.
Correct.
Only when you know and your heart is opened up. So he's opening up our hearts here. There's not a single person in this church who has a marriage that is all that God intended it to be.
Right.
No one.
Right.
I mean, I've had whole years where consistently I'm just failing my spouse, failing to show up. You know, we experience this as pastors all the time.
Yeah.
That we can, and this is not to make the congregation like worry about us or something like that, but it's really easy to give everyone attention except for your spouse.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of the joke or the illustration would be the builder's house, right? You know, if you spend all day long working, building, installing someone's kitchen for them in their bathroom, when you get home at 6 p.m., the last thing you want to do is go and, you know, weed the yard and, you know, rehang a door.
It's like the chef who cooks gourmet meals for them all day, and then they go home and they have a TV dinner.
And yet what's interesting, and, you know, we want to get to the wider issue of divorce and remarriage in a minute, but a lot of the pastoral epistles that talk about the calling of a pastor, they actually say very little about pastoring. They say an awful lot about the home, the husband of one wife. They talk about managing your wife and your household and your children well. And so it's interesting that Paul, teaching Timothy, for example, how to be a good pastor, says actually it begins at home.
Yeah.
It really does begin with catechesis in the home, of serving your wife as Christ loved the church, of laying down your life, of mutual submission, of all of these things.
Yeah.
And you can't actually pastor in the wider congregation effectively unless you're discharging the basic duties at home first. And so any pastors listening to this, you know this stuff, but it really does have to begin with integrity at home.
Yeah.
Otherwise, eventually, the thing breaks up. And look how many really well-known, highly successful, influential pastors on the global stage have tanked their ministry by tanking their marriage.
They got too big for their britches, sort of.
There's a list of it. It's huge. There's an endless list of this stuff. So it is right to be calling people to a biblical standard. It's right to be living it yourself insofar as you can. And of course, we all fail.
I also think, though, there's in Jesus's vision and his teaching, there's there's an expansive, and I hope we go here more, expansive hope for people who, when we're in those moments where like the relationship has suffered trauma and is in many ways like a living hell, because that happens.
It does happen.
And I think we all know what it's like to have those broken relationships. I mean, I do. And it's brutal to walk through that, but there's actually this brings us out to the rest of the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
This whole thrust toward reconciliation.
That's
that
the goal,
is
isn't
enacting.
it? And of course, you only need to reconcile if something's broken.
Yeah.
So healing and reconciliation are the aim of the Sermon on the Mount. But Jesus here is talking about, you know, what happens when things break completely. And in the question of divorce, verse 31, he says, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. So he's referencing the old covenant law where it was possible to obtain a divorce.
Like, you got to do it legally?
Yeah. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So what he says is that if you divorce your wife in their culture, right, she's going to be forced to remarry because she didn't have the economic opportunities that a man had.
So first century Israel, very patriarchal culture that Jesus is teaching, is walking into here, right?
Yeah.
and there's a set of laws legally. You can't, like, women couldn't divorce their husbands.
Right. So first of all, it would be the man initiating the divorce.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And he says, if you do this, you're forcing her into an adulterous relationship because she's going to have to find someone else, because she has no means of earning her own way in their culture.
So she's kind of, if the man divorces his wife, mm-hmm. he's forcing her either to violate Torah or basically starve to death because she has no recourse. She's really a victim in this situation.
She would have to remarry, or she would have to become a prostitute or a thief or a beggar.
Yeah.
Or just throw herself on the grace of the community and her family.
Oh, I just heard this.
You're putting her in a bind.
I just heard this while I was kind of studying up for this sermon. So we often read, where Jesus is at the well and he meets the Samaritan woman. Yeah. And he's like, you've had, he asked her to bring her husband and she's like, I have no husband. And he's like, you're right, you have no husband. You've had 7 husbands and the one with you now is not her husband. We always assume that she's just an unfaithful, promiscuous woman. But actually, if you think about it in terms of first century divorce law, she's been probably widowed multiple times, and she's kind of the castaway. She's the reject.
Right.
Because she would not have been leaving her husband. She's
been rejected by numerous people who made vows to her. She's
been discarded. And so he's speaking to an extremely vulnerable person. I think that's really important.
Who's ashamed. Yeah. She's out there collecting water on her own and in the heat instead of with all the other women.
And what do you know? Jesus has a lot to say to rejected, ashamed people.
Right. So in the heart of this is an exception. Jesus says, except on the ground of sexual immorality. So there's this interesting exception here. And we're going to have to go outside of the passage a little bit to amplify or to understand this exception, because he picks back up on this point later in Matthew.
Can I make one note on this?
Yes.
I think it's important in this discussion that we just admit this is not... Matthew 5 is not giving us a comprehensive, full-scale teaching on divorce and remarriage. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways we know that is that in Matthew 19, the issue comes up again. And whereas right here, it gets, 2 verses? In Matthew 19, it has a whole giant paragraph, 12 verses.
Right.
12 pretty long verses that we could read if you want. But And then Paul goes on to talk about it. And so all of Scripture is God-breathed and useful. So we have to look at this. This is weighing in on a specific context.
Yeah.
And
let's allow Scripture to interpret Scripture.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that said, it might be worth just sort of digging a little into some of the subjects that we're going to talk about in the adult forum.
Yeah.
And it is, we're essentially fleshing out the diocesan and Christchurch policy on divorce and remarriage by looking at the range of different Christian views on divorce and remarriage.
I can't see your computer screen. Do you have the handout?
Yeah, I've got a copy of it in front of me, so I can see it too.
Get ready, adult forum attending people. Alex has put together actually Bridget made the graphic, but a cool and colorful handout. Are you going to print this on color on Sunday?
I think so. I think we're going to use some of my color allowance.
We're going to How many do you have? I have I think my color allowance is 3.
I managed to break in and
cheated
mine's 999,999 copies. I'm the rector of this church and I'm going to print in color. So that's what I've got. Yeah. I've used up some of my lives. There are different Christian viewpoints. I think it's worth saying that we're not necessarily saying what we think. I'm trying to show what different ideas exist within the bounds of legitimate Christian thinking.
Okay, so this is helpful because we're talking here about kind of the practical pastoral issue here, because I'm let's be honest, in 22 minutes in a sermon, I'm not about lust and divorce. That's not going to happen. So,
yeah, this isn't going to be helpful to talk about in a sermon, but this is helpful for people who are trying to understand doctrine or practice in the Christian church. And so let's begin with viewpoint number one, which is classically a Roman Catholic understanding.
Oh, yeah.
And that is that divorce is impossible. So we're not even going to talk about whether we can or whether we should or whether we will. You can't have one.
Like they
don't exist.
So if you file for a no-fault divorce, you and your spouse go and marry other people. Technically, the Roman Catholic Church would say
you didn't.
No, actually, you're still married to each other.
Yes. You may well have a legal piece of paper that says this, that, and the other, but in the eyes of the church, they would say, which is the eyes of God, they would say, it's not real.
Okay.
So once married, always married. And the technical term for this is indissolubility. That is to say, it's not capable of being dissolved. And the text behind this Catholic doctrine is Mark 10:9. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. These are the words that we say in the marriage service when we proclaim someone as husband and wife. Those whom God has joined together, let not man put asunder. That's
so they mean they interpret that to mean not man shouldn't separate, but rather it is impossible for man to separate.
Yeah, man can't undo something that God has done.
Okay,
that's the Catholic position as I understand it,
and that's rooted in the Genesis. I mean, I would agree with a part of this, that there's that Genesis 2 vision. In the image of God, he created... Is that Genesis 1? Or that's Genesis 1, I guess.
Right.
He created the male... No, that's Genesis 2.
Oh, 2:17, is it?
I forget.
Right.
I should know this, but that's all right. There's a lot of things I should know, but don't. In the image of God, he created the human. Male and female, he created them. So, and then Genesis 2:17...
1:27, actually. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them.
And then... a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So basically, one flesh innate. Yeah. You can't one flesh innate.
Yes, you become one flesh. You can't one fleshness. Oh. It's not possible, they would say.
I was trying to coin a word.
No, I think you've done well. But within Roman Catholic doctrine, there is the concept of something called an annulment, and not to be confused with the legal annulment. Square brackets, in the law at large, in the law of Allegheny County, you can get an annulment that is the legal stamp that the marriage never existed in the first place because there was bigamy or lack of capacity to consent or coercion or something, right? They would say it wasn't legitimately entered into. Well, in Roman Catholicism, there's a similar concept. It overlaps to some extent with the legal one, but there can be lack of form. So, for example, if you're a Roman Catholic, you want to marry a Protestant and you want to get married in a Protestant church, you can apply to the bishop for a dispensation to get married in a different denomination. And he can grant that. And if he grants it, the marriage is legitimate in the eyes of the Roman Catholic Church. However, if you go ahead and do it without the bishop's permission...
It's not a marriage.
It can be considered not to have been a marriage. And then you can apply for an annulment, which says... it never existed.
Now, they in medieval times, they would sort of dole this out like candy corn, right? Like,
well, in exchange for money. Yeah. That's right.
You get your marriage annulled, and famously, for us Anglicans, King Henry VIII, he wanted to get an annulment of his marriage,
and the Pope said no.
Pope said no. So Henry decided to court those Protestant theologians, reforming theologians, and appointed Cranmer as Archbishop. And
whose birthday it is today?
It's Cranmer's birthday
today.
Happy birthday,
Thomas Cranmer.
Tommy.
Yeah.
Tomo,
as he likes to be known.
Tomo Cranmer. Tomo Cranmer.
So Roman Catholic annulment would be a theological statement that the marriage was not legitimate in the first place. It of course brings up several problems because we've already been talking about sex outside of marriage as adultery. So that it leaves that undealt with. But that's viewpoint number one. divorce is not possible. Viewpoint number 2, and it's actually using the same text. Divorce is possible. It's just not allowed.
Yeah.
So Mark 10:9, right, which says, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate."
Same idea.
Means man can separate it, but may not, must not, should not,
Okay.
shall not.
Don't do it.
Yeah.
No matter
You
what.
could do it, but don't do it. And in which case, it's just like any other sin. Yeah. You can go and kill a guy. Don't do it.
So no matter what, if you are under this view, if your spouse beats you regularly, and is constantly verbally abusive, and you say, "That's it, I'm done. I need to get out of this situation," you've sinned.
Correct.
Okay, just being clear.
When I say correct, I mean that's
view.
that's a correct description of what this school of thought says.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the Catholic view, or view 1, I don't want to necessarily...
I mean, view one, the indissolubility argument is it's just not possible. View 2 is it's possible, but it's never allowed.
Okay.
And the reason why it's never allowed is not because divorce is an unusually bad sin. All right, there are lots of sins. It's that marriage is an unusually important thing.
Okay.
And because marriage, the marriage of people to each other, is a mirror of the marriage of God to his church. And so you're doing something, you're breaking a covenant, would be this view.
Okay.
It is touched upon in Malachi 2. And Malachi 2 is interesting because for a long time it was translated one way. The Hebrew is very, very difficult, but modern translations translate it another way. You may have heard the phrase, God hates divorce.
Mm-hmm.
That's the King James translation of Malachi 2:16.
Ah.
But most modern translations think that the hating word there is actually the part of the sentence to do with how the husband feels about his wife. That if a man hates his wife and divorces her, he covers his garment with violence. These are very obscure Hebrew words. But covering a garment with violence is a phrase that appears in the Psalms twice, in Revelation once. It is the defiling of your robes.
Does it mean pooping yourself?
Excrementalized robes, possibly.
Oh, interesting.
Or something like that. Yeah. So
so my kids cover their garments with violence.
Potentially.
Not all of them, but okay.
Well, we had a great many excrementalized robes in this church when I joined, because
because you joined, or were they that way before, or
correlation is not necessarily causation, but when my office was stacked full of sweat-ridden robes that had been worn by the choir since time immemorial and never washed, and the stench was appalling. So I read Malachi 2:16 and I thought of that. For those who don't have it in front of them, the man who does not love his wife but divorces her, says the Lord, the God of Israel, covers his garment with violence, says the Lord of hosts. So guard yourself in your spirit and do not be faithless. Clearly, this is saying divorce is bad. And it seems to be perhaps just choosing not to love your wife anymore is something that is going to defile you. So those that hold to viewpoint number 2, divorce is possible, like any sin, but never permissible, like any sin, would say, and that's because it defiles you.
Okay. Got it. Viewpoint 3?
Yeah, so I'm really annoyed with the Borough Council of Fox Chapel because they have removed one of the most useful sermon illustrations in the borough.
Oh, yeah.
There was a stop sign.
Yeah, they removed that at the intersection of Powers Run.
So crazy. And it's really crazy now. It's much more dangerous.
Wait, where you're going right from Powers Run onto Fox Chapel?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
They got rid of that.
They did. And now they've
lame.
replaced it with a flashing light and a load of dangerous cars all over the place.
Oh, yeah.
Terrible.
Naturally.
Anyway, there was, in the olden days, a stop sign there. And it was a stop sign that said on it, stop. And then underneath, in little tiny letters, it said, except turn right.
Except turn right, yeah.
So there was a rule, you must stop. And there was an exception in small print under the rule, unless you're doing this, this, and this.
Near on the way to Sam's school in Plum, they have one of those still. Plum hasn't done that blasphemy.
So for those listening in Justin's church in Plum, you will be able to understand this illustration more easily.
Yeah.
Viewpoint number 3. Divorce. The Bible says, don't do it. Stop. However, there are a few exceptions in small print written underneath the sign.
And Jesus seems to clearly understand this.
Right. So what did our text say? I've gone through so many different Bible verses, I've lost it.
It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, or porneia in the Greek, makes her commit adultery.
Great. So there you go. There's that word except.
Except.
Right. So it does seem as though the absolute prohibition on divorce is coupled with some small print exceptions that in narrow circumstances, it is in fact permissible, right? That's the ordinary understanding of this language. In which case the question then becomes, what are the exceptions? And where do we draw the line?
Yeah.
Right.
And this is where it gets interesting and a little murky.
I'd say. Exception number 1, sexual immorality, right? Except on the ground of sexual immorality, porneia, that's the word you use, right?
Porneia. From which we get pornography.
We do. It's a word that is really hard to define, it seems. Mm-hmm. It isn't just adulterous sexual intercourse.
Yeah, so John Stott says that essentially porneia is usually translated fornication, denotes the immorality of the unmarried, and it's often distinguished from moikeia, or adultery, the immorality of the married. So he says, for this reason, some have argued that this exceptive clause permits divorce if some premarital sexual sin is later discovered. But he says, basically, that's not what it's going on here.
No, I don't think so.
Porneia is derived from porne, a prostitute, without specifying whether she or her client is married or unmarried. So anything that is basically illicit, sexually illicit behavior, I think it would be the way that I would probably define it.
So someone who has this position, which is what we're calling position number 3, exception number 1, would say that because sexual fidelity is such a foundational aspect of Christian life and marriage life, any kind of sexual affair breaks that covenant bond, and then that releases the party who's not at fault.
Yes.
To remarry, to divorce and remarry. Of course,
what's the idea there? That that person has, like, you've been in this covenant, and that person has destroyed or killed the covenant.
Yes.
They've totally left they have left the covenant, and so therefore there's no covenant anymore. It's kind of gone.
You've killed the covenant,
and so therefore divorcing them is just sort of a recognition of what's already happening or what's already happened. Maybe.
Yeah, something like that. And of course, the difficulty is that porneia, being such a broad word, leaves us really unable to draw a solid line here.
We were debating this earlier. So what about the couple where one of the members is looking regularly at pornography or addicted to pornography? Yeah. Does that constitute sexual immorality, adultery?
Well, it does, yes, biblically. It does, yeah. And because, we've just done a little podcast on lust, right? And Jesus is saying there in the passage before this one that looking at people with lustful intent is the same as adultery.
Yeah.
So you could take the view that essentially anyone can get a divorce because everyone has done this sin.
But if you're walking along and you notice that your spouse, gives someone the eye or something like that, or has a wandering eye for a second, does that mean that your covenant of marriage with them is now dissolved, and you can just be like, "Oh, you messed up, divorce time."
Right?
Is that what Jesus is saying?
And so, if you were to talk about it in an abstract sense, that you could make that case. I think the problem with it is, if you look at the context of the Sermon on the Mount, like you were saying earlier, just before we click record, if you look at the context of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is often beefing up the law, not trying to run it through with a coach and horses.
Yeah, he's not taking a minimalist interpretation where it's like, what can I get away with? He's looking, in the Sermon on the Mount, he's taking a maximalist interpretation. What is the heart of the law?
Now, we could be accused here of inconsistency in our interpretation, and maybe we should accuse ourselves of it. But I think what he's saying is something along the lines of, if you're feeling really proud that you've never committed adultery, think again, you kind of have in your heart. Now, if you have been egregiously wounded by your spouse's infidelity, that may well give you an exception to this no divorce rule. But if there's a kind of footling and small indiscretion, that probably doesn't.
Well, this has there's a debate that this is entering in on between Shammai and Hillel, these two rabbis in the first century.
Oh, now we're into it. Okay.
Yeah, let's just do this real quick.
Okay. Sure.
So Shammai, is he the liberal or the conservative?
He's the conservative. Shammai is the conservative. Okay.
So Hillel says, what basically Moses told you to get a certificate of divorce. So if your wife burns your food, because remember, ladies, you can't get a divorce. Period. You have no legal recourse.
Or she has a bulbous nose.
Yeah, or a bulbous nose. Yeah. If he finds his wife no longer attractive, then he can divorce her for any reason.
Any cause divorce was a phrase, a loaded term in Hillelite thinking.
Yeah, it's based on a Hebrew word in Deuteronomy 24.
Correct.
But we're not going to go into that right now.
Okay.
And then Shammai said,
no.
He said, wait a minute. That text is referring to sexual immorality, to adultery.
Yeah.
And so the only reason for divorce would be adultery.
Right. And the Pharisees come up to Jesus in Matthew 19 and say, so whose side do you want, Hillel or Shammai? And Jesus says, well, kind of neither. Bit more Shammai than Hillel, but kind of neither. So he says, I'm certainly not with Hillel. I don't think you can divorce your wife because you don't like her nose. The thing about Shammai is he seems to be thinking you must get a divorce if she sleeps around. And Jesus is saying, actually, you can get one. It's permissible. But, and he leaves it with this permission language, leaves it for us to infer that you don't have to. You could, in fact, reconcile with your spouse.
And I think it's worth noting that this more conservative interpretation of the Old Testament actually protected the women. Because if you can...
Oh, yeah. Well, you imagine.
If men could just cast a woman away for any and every reason.
Like the Samaritan woman had been.
Yeah. That really creates a big hierarchy. And it creates a low view of women. And so Jesus is actually, he's going back to, he's calling the men out in lust, as we theoretically said in the podcast that will come out before this one, but we haven't recorded yet.
Yeah, that one.
But also he's creating more, making it more difficult for the separation to happen, which for the most vulnerable in the society, that's good news. Okay,
so let's summarize this then. The first position, the classically Roman Catholic position, would be divorce is ontologically impossible. God joins people, men can't unjoin them.
Yep.
The second position, using the same text, would be divorce is technically possible, like any sin, but it's never permissible, like any sin. You can't do it. And then the third idea would be, well, there's a stop sign with some small print underneath, and the small print says this, you can't do it, but if there's been sexual immorality, you can if you must. And then, of course, where you draw the line as to what sexual immorality really means, that there's a whole spectrum of Christian viewpoints there, but we would suggest, for logical sense really to hold, it must mean something fairly egregious that really wounds the marriage beyond it being fixable.
Like
so not probably, I don't know, a double look at someone running by in the park.
No.
But it could involve things that aren't just simply physical sexual adultery.
Yeah. We have to remember, and I think there's some need for wisdom in this. we have to remember that Jesus is pushing in everything toward covenant faithfulness and reconciliation.
Right. And that would be the desire. And of course, that requires two people to want it.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're into another exception. And so far, the discussion has been on the premise that the parties to the marriage, the man and the woman, are both believers.
Yes.
Of the same faith. Right. And when Christ was talking, that was pretty much always the case. But by the time Paul is speaking to the Mediterranean churches, you've got all sorts of people who'd been pagans, who'd been Greeks of various kinds, and Romans. You've got Jews. You've got Christians. You've got second generation Christians maybe starting to emerge. You've got all sorts of different people. You've got people who may enter into a marriage both pagan, and one of them converts and becomes a Christian, and the other doesn't.
All the time. Yeah.
Right. So now we've got mixed marriages in the Pauline context of 1 Corinthians. And this is potentially another one of those small print exceptions underneath the stop sign. And we're calling it separation.
Separation.
By a non-believer.
And the classic idea is abandonment.
Abandonment.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7. If the unbelieving partner separates, so you're a Christian, your non-Christian spouse separates from you, which could mean something.
They leave you. Yeah.
Let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister, that would be you, is not enslaved. The brother or sister in Christ is not enslaved. So you're married to a non-believer, they separate from you, you're no longer enslaved.
Yeah.
We've got to really dig into the word separate and enslave to understand what he means.
Separate is chorizo,
Yep.
which can
like
mean
the sausage.
divorce.
It can also be like a spiced sausage.
Really?
Spanish.
Oh, yeah. Chorizo?
Yeah.
Oh, that was a joke. That was good. Yeah, I get it.
I believe it's just a joke, yeah.
Yeah, chorizo. Yeah, I'm going to think of the Spanish, chorizo
Salami.
all the time now. Trader Joe's makes a vegan chorizo.
That doesn't sound good.
It's not. I liked it when I was a vegan, but no longer.
Yeah. So the Greek word is chorizo. Chorizo.
It often means to isolate, depart, remove, or distance. And then the word slave is doulao, which can include the idea of being under obligation. Probably it can also mean servant.
Yeah. And David Instone Brewer, scholar, has delved deeply into volumes of early Jewish divorce settlement papers. These certificates of divorce. Well, he likes it. And what he notices is in these certificates of divorce that were written, the word doulao often occurs. The person's no longer enslaved. What that means is they're no longer bound or tied up with the bonds of the previous marriage.
So you're free.
Yeah, and so the question would be, well, why did Paul not use the word deo, which is the usual Greek word for loosen?
Bind. Yeah.
Yeah, luo and deo, as we've talked about in this podcast before, which would be tie up and untie up. Why did he not say the untie word, which would be probably a bit more vivid? And David Instone Brewer says the doulao word is simply here. It might seem surprising until you know it, because that was the Jewish divorce settlement language of the time. So, of course, this now requires us to do something quite liberal and interpret scripture based upon what some bloke said off the internet. But if we're willing to do that, and we are blokes on the internet, then he might be onto something. So, what have we got here? We've got two people. They're married. One's a believer. One's a non-believer. The non-believing spouse separates, chorizos, which could mean divorce. It could mean isolates, departs, removes, distances themselves, goes away. They're no longer here. They have abandoned you. They've gone, right?
Yeah.
Gone. You can't get them back because they're not here. In that case, you're no longer doulaoed. You're no longer enslaved to that person, and more specifically, no longer enslaved to that marriage. But you're now free.
They've just left the marriage. They've left the covenant.
Right.
Altogether.
But this abandonment word, it's a strong word, right? This doesn't mean they're in the garden shed too much playing with their trains.
So you can't be like, well, okay, I'm going to set an ultimatum. If you don't arrange several dates for me, in the next month, then I'm going to constitute that as that you've abandoned the marriage.
It's a strong word.
It's a very specific, strong idea of someone who's, despite your best efforts to reconcile, they have utterly refused it.
I mean, a really great cast iron example would be your non-believing spouse goes off with another person and marries them. That's 100% abandonment.
Boom.
Right? Because you cannot put your marriage back together.
Okay.
You can't be, because they've now gone and got a new one. So if I were a pastor in this situation, I would and have remarried people in that situation.
I have too.
But of course, that person's also got the adultery exception as well. So they've got a bingo card of biblical exceptions, in my view.
Yeah.
Now, exception number 3, it's the same exact word, but it relies upon a different translation. And this is probably the weakest of the 3 exceptions that we're going to countenance here. There are others that believers countenance, but I don't think of them as legitimate biblical ideas. So this is the smallest of the fine print now, and it's debatable, I think.
Yeah.
But I would if someone holds this position, I wouldn't say, oh, they're faithless and wicked. Okay, so separation, chorizo, the sausage. It can also mean to put asunder. That's another meaning of the word, right? What those whom God has joined, let not man put asunder. Or what if you do put it asunder?
Just as in like destroy.
Yeah, this is the word they used when they got a cargo vessel and it was wrecked in a storm against the rocks. The storm settles, and suddenly there's bits of wood floating everywhere and bits of cargo floating everywhere, and it's all sort of floating around in the sea together, right? It's not been abandoned; it's still there.
Yeah.
But it's so smashed to smithereens that there's no way you're putting that ship back together. The cargo's soaked, bits of it are on the bottom of the ocean.
So the obvious practical example of this would be a person who is abused by their spouse, spousal abuse, someone who has become, instead of being the loving covenant partner whose images Christ, has become an instrument of death and destruction to their spouse, and who's a danger, a physical and sometimes emotional too, and spiritual danger to them.
Well, these would be one of the where do you draw the line within the line type arguments. What constitutes destruction? Wounding with weapons. What about blunt trauma? Well, what about pushing, strangulation? Well, what about henpecking? What about slander? Like, where do you draw the line? And is it once or 10 times? Like, how often does it have to be to count? I mean, now we're really peering into the depths of kind of pastoral decision making. Yeah. But some kind of weighty, destructive behavior that has, for all intents and purposes, driven the marriage on the rocks and prevented it from ever being put back together.
But here's the tricky piece, is that in my own marriage, I don't think that we've ever been at a point where we're close to divorce or had anywhere grounds to divorce, but I haven't engaged in weighty, destructive behavior toward my spouse. Like I've nitpicked and...
But no one's compelling Jenna to divorce you. And
this is true.
That's the beauty of a marriage, is it's really characterized by forgiveness.
Yeah. So we fail each other as a believer in a marriage, right? When your spouse fails you, and they will, and when you fail your spouse, the call of the gospel is toward reconciliation, because Christ, who himself was engaged in the most dysfunctional marriage of all time, is engaged in the most dysfunctional marriage of all time.
With us.
God is in the ultimate bad marriage. With the most unfaithful and abusive spouse. And he went to all that distance to reconcile himself to us. And so we're drawn into this pattern of reconciliation. There are some times, I think that what Paul and Jesus are both acknowledging, are there are some times where putting back that marriage or that relationship in the way that it was is not possible or wise. And so there's a reason to, there have to be exceptions to this. even though God's creational intent is for the one flesh union of the couple. And so,
and that's, don't forget, this is in the context of a mixed marriage where you've got a believer and a non-believer. And Paul goes on to say, if you have been through this position and you're now intending to remarry, you can only marry in the Lord. He says, don't forget, you can only marry another Christian. It's never permissible for a Christian to marry a non-Christian.
Yeah.
Under any circumstances.
Yeah.
And again, here we get into that very difficult kind of pastoral decision-making and wisdom stuff. Well, how do you know whether the person's a believer or not? Like, they might come to church and not be a believer.
Yeah.
It's really hard. You can tell a tree by its fruit, but what you can't do is judge people. So it's very, very hard. And at this point, I think faithful people and faithful pastors are doing their best to try and work a fine line through a very delicate kind of series of problems. For those who want to know, Christchurch Fox Chapel policy, and some of it's on the internet, we do hold to the exception 1 and exception 2 principle. So that is to say, we will remarry people where there's been sexual immorality of an egregious nature, and we will remarry people where there's been separation by a non-believer of a final nature. We're open to talking about exception 3 in very serious circumstances, and the bishop will allow that also.
Yeah. I think maybe before we close, I want to share something that John Stott said that I thought
and
was
you're going
really
to put
wise.
a link to this in the show notes, I'm imagining.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to do the show notes.
We don't have show notes.
We don't have show notes. No. There we go.
All right, but can I give a plug for this book? And then you read from yours. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So
Fine. You first.
Plug from this book. There's a book called Remarriage After Divorce, 3 Views in Today's Church. These are 3 different views from people who, I would consider them all to be conservative evangelical scholars. I know one of them personally. I've corresponded with another at length. And we've got all 3 on our shelves. Gordon Wenham, William Heth, Bill Heth, and Craig Keener. And they go through the... Wenham is in the no, not ever camp, and Heth, who's actually changed his mind, is in the exception 1 and 2 camp, and Keener is in the exception 1, 2, and 3 camp. And it's really interesting to listen to them interact with each other and argue their points. So I recommend that book to you.
Who's the one you don't know?
Keener. I don't know Craig Keener.
I was hoping you knew Craig Keener. He's
Gordon
cool.
Wenham's the best teacher I've ever had.
Really?
Yeah.
He's a good commentator too.
He's brilliant.
Yeah. John Stott also is good. He says this. So speaking personally as a Christian pastor, he writes, whenever somebody asks to speak with me about divorce, I have now for some years steadfastly refused to do so. I have made the rule never to speak with anybody about divorce until I have first spoken with him or her about 2 other subjects, namely marriage and reconciliation. It is only when a person has understood and accepted God's view of marriage and God's call to reconciliation that a possible context has been created within which one may regretfully go on to talk about divorce. This principle of pastoral priorities is, I believe, consistent with the teachings of Jesus. I think it's helpful for us we need to be grounded in a really rich theology of marriage and be working toward that covenant faithfulness and trusting that God is able to he's able to repair far more than we think he is able to. Mm-hmm. That he's faithful in enacting miracles and bringing life where there is no life. Mm. It's this is a sensitive and difficult thing to kind of like jump in on.
Yeah. But let's not shy away from it. The Sermon on the Mount addresses it. Yeah. We're grown-ups. And what we're not going to do is just hide away from difficult subjects.
No.
You can do that for a bit, but ultimately that isn't going to help the body of Christ. God in his wisdom decided to teach on this subject. And for us in our wisdom to decide to avoid it would be a deeply faithless thing to do.
Yeah. That's a Wolpian crescendo, if I've ever seen one.
Music seems a little light-hearted for the theme.
Yeah. It's okay.
I'll play it quiet.
Yeah. Sometimes we have those podcasts.
Yeah. Well, this has been one of the more difficult but interesting subjects. For those of you listening to podcast Friday, Saturday, do come to the Adult Forum on Sunday, the, I don't know what it is, 7th or 8th of June, and we'd love to see you there to talk about it between the services at 10:15. Thanks for stopping by.
And stay classy.